Today I'm going to be talking about a project on financial sanctions. This is a project that we've been working on for quite a bit, but very recently, last spring, added an entirely additional state to the project, which would seem like a Herculean effort, but things like this are much easier to accomplish when you have administrative data systems that already go through and harmonize records, and so I'll talk a bit about CJARs in the process of that. This is co-authored work with Keith Finley, who's at the U.S. Census Bureau, so this includes a disclaimer that this doesn't represent the official views of the Census Bureau, and all of the results that you're going to see have gone through disclosure review to protect privacy and confidentiality. Okay. So financial sanctions or legal financial obligations are imposed on individuals who come into contact with the justice system on a regular basis. This can take the form of a variety of different vehicles, whether that's restitution, payments directly to victims, fines, a sanction-based fine just to penalize someone to discourage criminal activity, or fees, which could be like court processing fees, probation fees, basically paying for the services of being charged with an offense. There's been increased reliance on courts and law enforcement's revenue from financial sanctions. So there's work that shows that these justice agencies respond to the incentives they faced in terms of their revenue generation from fines and fees. And the annual revenue from financial sanctions is, and recent estimates put it larger than $15 billion. If you were at my last talk about CJARs, talking about the scope of spending in the justice system, that's about $285 billion overall. So it's not the predominant way that agencies are funded, but it's not a trivial share. And fines and fees in kind of popular research have received growing attention in popular work. And they've been linked with concerns about financial instability, criminal recidivism, poor labor market outcomes. If you can't pay your fee, then you kind of get further into the system, and that makes it harder to dig your way out. And sometimes they even generate more fees. Fees beget late fees, beget, all sorts of things. So what do we do in this project? We're going to integrate extensive administrative microdata for longitudinal analysis of financial sanctions in the U.S. justice system. And this is going to be building on recent RCT evidence that was published in ASR by, I think this was Deva's last publication, but Pedro et al. I was looking at a randomized control trial for debt forgiveness in Oklahoma County and looking at what impact that had. I think on average about $3,000 were forgiven in debt to the criminal justice system. And while this showed impacts on debt collection activity, it did not show any impact on reoffending behavior over the first year, which is what they could track. So what we're going to be doing in this project is a little different, both kind of in terms of the outcomes we look at, the timeline that we follow people over, and the source of identification or exogenous variation that we're looking at. We don't have a randomized control trial. We're going to be using the abrupt introduction of the driver responsibility programs in Michigan and Texas and a regression discontinuity framework as our source of exogenous variation. And relative to some of the other work that's been done in this literature, sorry, I'm going in and out of the local mic. What I like about the RD approach is that this provides us like very clean, testable identifying assumptions. And everyone's going to be followed up with the kind of same incentives in place, because at the discontinuity over a 10-year follow-up period, everyone is basically subject to these fines and fees. It's not that like in a diff and diff environment, the incentives that people are facing depending on where they are in the follow-up period varies. And we're going to have multiple natural experiments, which is also reassuring that this both increases our internal validity of any potential violations of a single RD, but also enhances the external validity because we're looking across very different states with different kind of institutional arrangements, and that same theme of expanding on this important RCT evidence from Pedro et al. We're moving out of kind of an urban county solely in Oklahoma County. And then finally, we're going to link to potential household spillovers, which is going to measure potentially important unintended consequence of fines and fees. Yep.
When we think of the fines and fees, are they levied specifically on the individual, or do sometimes they get levied on the community?
No, it's levied on the individual. Now, how that's played out in practice is part of the reason why we think it's important to look at household spillovers, because individuals who have justice involvement are known to have a lower or weaker labor market attachment. And so it's possible that somebody else is effectively footing the bill because of a shared budget constraint, even if they aren't literally the one making the payment.
And if something, like,
yep.
if they fall into, like, delinquency, does the family have any, like, liability? Like, would they be responsible, like a spouse or something?
Yeah, I'll talk about the enforcement mechanism. These specific programs are enforced through driver's license suspensions. So in contrast to criminal debt, there's no, you wouldn't be put in jail, for instance, for this. And I'm not sure exactly how this interacts with debt collection agencies. But by and large, the enforcement mechanism is that they'll suspend your license if you don't pay. And then you have to pay that amount and an additional fee to get your license reinstated. And I don't think they really aggressively pursued outstanding debt. I'll get into this a bit more soon. Yeah. Good questions. Keep them coming. Okay, so what do we learn from this study? Not to be a downer, but we basically show a bunch of very strong null results. We don't find that these fines and fees really generate any measurable change in behavior. Now, there are two ways that I think about this evidence. One is that there's, we don't find kind of evidence in support of the popular theories about poverty traps generated by criminal debt. We don't see changes in the criminal trajectories of people who face these fines and fees. We don't see employment responses. So you might think, oh, your driver's license is suspended, you can no longer get to work. I think probably what ended up happening is a bunch of people got their licenses suspended and they just kept driving to work. And they just never got caught because the likelihood of getting pulled over is so low. There's also no indication of a systematic response from other household members. So given that we found nulls on the individuals, our next thought was, well, maybe they weren't the ones paying for it anyways because they didn't have jobs. Maybe it was somebody else in the family who was stepping up to pay that debt. We don't find any evidence of that either. There's no real clear employment or crime response for the other household members that we can track. So that's like saying, well, maybe fines and fees, aren't as bad as we make them out to be. At the same time, what I'd like to point out is the fines and fees didn't achieve the point of the program. We observed no general deterrent response. So there was no change in the overall crime rates for traffic-related offenses. And they had very serious limited success with raising funds. And in fact, both of these programs were completely discontinued after 15 years, and they forgave automatically $3.1 billion in outstanding debt. Right, so it's like, maybe they're not as bad as, at least this specific program, it isn't as bad as some people make it out to be, but it's also not serving a purpose. So maybe we just shouldn't have it at all. Yeah, Jeff.
This is indirectly referencing a different policy domain. Did they refund the payments of people?
They did not refund the payments, no. Yeah, which is really kind of interesting dynamic, yeah. Yeah, the question in the back.
What ratio, how much of the $3.1 billion, like, of the total amount levied is the $3 billion? That question makes sense?
Yeah. So, oh my God, sorry, I keep coming in and out of this one microphone. So we don't have the collection rates from when it was first introduced. They added a bunch of incentive programs in Texas and repayment programs in Michigan, which kind of creates a somewhat different institutional context because they're having such a hard time with people paying the debt. About 5 years into the programs, after that point, they found that the repayment rates were about 50% in Michigan and 60% in Texas. So that's going to be an upper bound on the total amount of fines and fees that were levied in terms of how much was paid back. Since those early years, we don't know the repayment rates. We don't have the payment information ourselves from this because it was handled by the secretaries of state outside of the justice system. But I would guess that the collection rates were less than 50% in terms of total fines and fees levied. Yeah.
Do you also have data on the other fees that are levied on the defendants here?
Yeah.
Like, DNA, public defender.
Yeah, we have some fines and fees that we collect that are part of CJAR's data in general. I don't think that it's exhaustive, but we do have that. And in the paper, we don't observe any change in those fines and fees in response. This is a really substantial increase in financial sanctions compared to steady state levels. Like the fines that people get from this program, depending on your offense, can go up to $6,000. All right, so the driver's responsibility fee program was a surcharge program originally pioneered in New Jersey in 1983. It basically existed in New Jersey. The goal was to reduce unsafe driving and tackle budget shortfalls, and it kind of lived just in New Jersey for a long time. The specific way it's implemented, there are two ways that drivers can incur fees, either through the point system for minor traffic infractions like speeding. This is not the focus of our paper. We don't have any information on the points. Our data is only from the justice system, so you have to do something that escalates to the level of resulting in a charged offense. That is the second mechanism, surcharges that were triggered by a conviction for certain driving offenses, like DUIs or driving with a suspended license. And you'll notice that there's like this recursion that is created by this program where by non-payment, you set yourself up to get additional DRF penalties, because now if you're driving with a suspended license, you're going to get another DRF. Now, although this was just basically like living by itself in New Jersey through the 80s and 90s, it got a lot of renewed popularity during the 2000s. And so Michigan, New York, Texas, and Virginia all adopted their own DRF programs during the early 2000s. If my memory is correct, it's either New York or Virginia discontinued it after like a year. They were like, actually, no, this isn't going to work for us. And I think the other state is still in existence. In CJARS, we only have the data, relevant data for Michigan and Texas. And so that's the focus of this project. All right, so this shows the timeline of when these programs were adopted. In Texas, it was implemented through House Bill 3588. Yep.
Yeah, just going back.
Yep.
It feels like, I mean, we already have fees that you pay when
Yep.
you get a speeding ticket and fees that you, so why is this different than kind of just than status quo? Just maybe we're charging more than we did before, but it feels like it's not fundamentally different, is it?
So I don't think that you should think of this as like a fundamentally different kind of sanction. It does come with the risk of a driver's license suspension, which I don't think that speeding tickets necessarily have, although that might be up to local jurisdictions. I think we do want to make the case that these types of fines aren't like atypical, that they inform our understanding of fines and fees in general. Now, just to reiterate, the types of behavior that we're looking at aren't the things that result in tickets. These are things that rise to the level of showing up in a criminal courtroom with a judge and a prosecutor. So this is going to be like DUI. You don't get a ticket for DUI, you get a conviction and a sentence, which can include a fine, but could also include jail time. Right? And so this is going to discretely increase the amount of financial obligations that you have after the program goes into effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except I guess I don't really know what you mean by these other things adopt. I mean, every state has something like that you have to pay some penalty if you get a DUI, right? Or like?
Not the prescribed financial sanction levels that are in place in these programs. This is a very significant increase in financial obligations that you're asked to pay relative to.
Yeah. Okay. It's a magnitude. It's not a fundamental difference, a magnitude effect, but the magnitude is large.
Yeah, and I think that it probably adds that. I mean, I think often the response to like a DUI, for instance, will be something like probation time and potentially jail time, depending on how far it is. This is then adding a really significant financial sanction on top of that.
How long do you have
Yeah.
to do those?
It's like 60 or 90 days. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more. They're spread out over multiple years, but from when the payments due, you have a very limited window. And that's part of what they were modifying by creating these installment plans later on. Okay, so Texas passed their bill in June 2003, and it became effective about 3 months later on September 1st, 2003. So this impacted any conviction on or after September 1st, 2003. Okay. The fines, depending on the level of your offense, ranged from $100 to $2,000 that then had to be paid every year for 3 years. So if you had the highest level DUI offense, you had to pay $2,000 3 years in a row, which is how you get up to $6,000 total. This was repealed in 2019 with immediate forgiveness of all outstanding debt. So there's a really kind of narrow window at the front end for potential anticipation effects. There will be some fishy things happening in the state of Texas that I'll show you in a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
There was no sort of income contingency of these fines in
No.
your state.
No. Yeah. And in Michigan, the timing is a little bit later, but pretty much essentially the same. They passed the law in August 2003. It became effective August 1st, 2003. A much shorter window, actually, than in Texas. It happened very quickly. Here, the fines range from $150 to $1,000, and it's only split across 3 tiers, and they're only levied for 2 years. So the maximum amount of fine that you could get in Michigan is $2,000, whereas in Texas, it's $6,000, right? So there are some differences in the way that these are being implemented. This was also repealed in 2008. Like the general public was very dissatisfied with it. The government was very dissatisfied with it. And so they all just basically said, we're going to close up shop on this. So maybe this whole paper isn't necessary because all the relevant people already knew that this was a bad program. But I'd like to think that we're learning something broader about financial sanctions here. Yeah, Lois.
Was this widely announced? Did people know about it? Or I was just thinking about the deterrent. Do you find no deterrent effects? Is that just people don't even know it's happening?
It's hard to go back and find evidence about, popular discussion of these policies. I think that they were pretty, widely promoted because the goal was to reduce, traffic fatalities. And so I think they knew that there was, a public relations campaign that went with that to try to make sure that people were responding. But
then the intended outcome.
yeah, it had no effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't. Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you know anything about the logic behind trying to do the consecutive years?
I don't. I think it's I could speculate. I think it's probably something about wanting to make sure that this isn't there's a reminder to the person that they shouldn't be doing this activity over time. But other than that, I don't know. I don't think it was intended as a beneficial thing to make it easier for people to make payments, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Texas doesn't have a state income tax, but Michigan does. Why didn't they just garnish the money from people's income taxes?
I don't know. I don't know why any policymakers make any decisions they do sometimes. You should reach out to them. Anyways, okay, I'm going to keep going. All right, so we're going to try to align these experiments together. Since there are a lot of commonalities between them. So even though there's 4 tiers in Texas and 3 tiers in Michigan, largely the top 2 tiers are just DUI in Texas, and the 3rd tier in Michigan is DUI. And so this is the breakout that we have for non-DUI and DUI offenses, where the lower ones are minor things like driving with a suspended license, and driving with on a suspended, revoked, or denied license, these minor offenses. The fees are much lower. And then the DUIs are much more serious, like repeated drunk driving or intoxicated driving. Okay, so to do this project, we're going to be using data from the Criminal Justice Administrative Records System. This is a data platform that contains longitudinal criminal court, prison, parole, and or probation records from 33 states currently in the United States. We'll be able to identify DRF eligible cases from charged offense descriptions, like text fields that we've coded into systematic offense codes using a machine learning tool called the text-based offense classification tool. If you have crime administrative data, we have a public portal that you can use to classify your data. It takes like 2 seconds, just to give a little plug to that. It's called Talk. We take that and we link it with through the Census Bureau with the Social Security Administration's Numiden file and best race files. This is, I think, a really poorly named data set. But what it represents is across all of the different data sources that the census has, your household, survey data, administrative data sources, what their best guess is at what your true self-identified race and ethnicity is. This is not some kind of QAnon hidden government that has a racist ideology. So this allows us to measure demographic characteristics, age, race, and ethnicity, and sex. Then we're going to link all of these data with IRS tax filings, including W-2 information returns and 1040 filings. So this will give us a nationwide measure of individual and household formal employment and earnings. So if you move out of the state of Michigan or Texas, we'll capture your employment activity through the IRS records. If you move out of the state of Texas or Michigan to another CJARS covered jurisdiction, we'll still capture your your involvement with the justice system. Yeah, Tim and then Elise.
You also have 1099s?
We do have 1099s. Yep.
So you can look at the effect. I've been long interested in the effect criminal fines on asset accumulation, or lack of asset accumulation, long run debt through your primary earnings years. So you could actually look at that with CJARS, but looking at 1099s over time.
Conditional on filing. And so the challenge is whether or not that's representative. Yeah.
Still.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, Elise.
My question is about non-filers, what
Yeah.
do you do about their incomes?
Yeah, so the W-2 information returns are really valuable because you don't, those are filed by your employers, right? And it's not dependent on filing rates. So those are like primary employment outcome, since it's not censored by whether or not individuals file taxes. Otherwise, there's not much that we can really do about that. If that makes sense. And then to link individuals who are being charged with DRFs to their significant others or partners, we're using this household crosswalk file that Keith and our former postdoc, Brittany Street, who's now at University of Missouri, and I developed, that uses the full arsenal of all census data that I don't have time to talk about today, but to basically try to figure out where everyone lives every year in the United States and who all of their kinship relationships and cohabitations are with. So we use that to identify pre-existing partners in whether or not that's a marital partner or somebody who's cohabiting with you in your household, and we think is a likely romantic partner. And then we basically apply these same outcomes to that group. Okay. So just to evangelize for a moment, I apologize for the grad students, you already saw this, but CJARS is the highest quality criminal justice research data repository that exists in the United States, and it's free and open for anyone to work with. Our goal in creating this data product, which I founded and I run out of the University of Michigan in collaboration with the US Census Bureau, is to really put the highest quality data in the hands of the best and brightest minds with a diversity of perspectives. And so we currently hold data from over 1,000 counties. You can see our map of where we hold significant data holdings. We have over a decade of criminal justice data coverage from at least one domain in enough states that we cover 60% of the population, and we're getting close to 75% once we nail down New York, New Mexico, and South Carolina. This has been something that we've been working on since 2016. We're really proud of it. And if you're interested in using CJARS, we have a really nice website. Well, we have an okay website, but a lot of materials on that website that can help support your work. And I'm happy to talk to you about that if you're interested. All right, so this is the empirical strategy in a nutshell. What you're seeing here are for individuals facing their first DRF-related offense. They're binned, I think for disclosure rules, we had to bin in something like 3-month intervals. I want to say. But it's basically on the x-axis is the date of your conviction. And on the y-axis is the probability of getting this DRF fine and the average amount of that DRF fine. So if you happen to be convicted of your DUI in Michigan on September 30th, 2003, there was zero likelihood that you got a DRF. There was zero DRF fine. If you're convicted the day after, on October 1st, then you had a 95% likelihood of getting a DRF because of the fact that some of these cases aren't convicted. And then of the DRF offense, and your average fine rate went up by about $2,500. No, by $1,400. It's the gray bars here. So the blue dots go to this scale, the gray diamonds go to this scale. Yep.
What does the picture look like if you do it with criminal fines that are given by the judge?
Yeah, we have that in the paper, and it's much lower. It's going to be around $50, and it's constant through the threshold.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. I don't think we have that in the slide deck, but it's in the paper for both. And then it's subject to the caveat that we probably don't measure all of them, because there might be like, the filing fee that you have to submit when you turn in your paperwork or something, and those like $25 fines add up, but it's not anywhere close to the level that we're talking about. In Texas, the fine went up by $2,500 for those who just happen to be convicted right after. There are a lot of additional cases that we include here because we're worried about people trying to endogenously plea down to things that aren't DRF covered. And so that's why these don't go up to 100%. And that's more common in Texas, which that's just one manifestation of something that's a bit more egregious that we'll see in a moment. All right, so it's basically just this RD idea. People show up once, and we're just looking at outcomes as you approach the discontinuity. Yeah, there's a question in the back.
On the Texas slide, it looks like things are not right at zero in the before period. Is there a little bit of font?
No, they're right at zero. It's just, it's a optical illusion. It's right at zero. Yeah.
The timing of this, but you said it was for timing of convictions, not a timing of when the event occurred.
Yep, that's right. And that's going to provide an opportunity for manipulation that we'll talk about momentarily. So we restrict the sample to individuals convicted of DRF-related offenses. So that's going to be DRF-eligible offenses, the DUIs, the driving with a suspended license, as well as other traffic offenses like reckless driving, highway obstruction, that you look at the records and you can see people getting pled down to these outcomes. And so we don't want that endogenous behavior to bias the estimation. We're going to use a 540-day window around the effective date. And so this is going to be slightly different in Michigan and Texas, but it's still the same width. And we're going to use only the first DRF-related conviction ever observed in CJARs to construct our sample so that we're avoiding the repeat entry of individuals into the analysis sample. We don't really want to deal with how to think about the clustering as well as the implied bias because, if one side of the discontinuity increases recidivism, then you're going to have people showing up a bunch of times on one side versus another, and that's problematic. All right, so potential sources of bias. So anticipation or manipulation could threaten the identification strategy here. So one would just be a general deterrent effect. If people respond in the way the policy was designed and they stop engaging in DUIs, that would be a problem because now the sample of people who are being convicted of DUIs before and after the event aren't going to be comparable. There could be law enforcement and court incentives with regard to funding opportunities. Mike Mikowski has a really nice line of research showing how criminal justice agencies take advantage of these opportunities to increase their own revenue streams. And in Texas, in particular, they got a share of the DRF fines. For Michigan, it just goes into the state budget, so they didn't have that incentive, but in Texas, they did. Then conditional on, the behavior that we're talking about, there could be responses once somebody's kind of going down the path of the justice system. So defendants could pursue activities to avoid these fines and fees, either plead to a lesser offense, hire better legal representation, or something like that. Or you could have potentially compassionate law enforcement or courts where they allow defendants they view to be sympathetic to find mechanisms to avoid these fines and fees, which could be a reflection of discrimination within those systems. So the natural thing that we look at when we're trying to assess the validity of identification assumptions within RD is just the caseload density. Like, does it look even over time? And in Michigan, for the most part, yeah, it does. Like, maybe there's a small decline, but for the most part, this is like a straight line through. And I think that from the rounding rules or the binning rules that we had, this is maybe looking a little bit more jumpy than I think is truly there. Yep.
I don't think I quite followed the first bullet point on the previous
Yep.
slide. So who is in the sample, and how would this, like,
For general deterrence?
Change in driving behavior affects whether you're in the sample or not?
Yeah, exactly. So like, let's suppose that there are two types of people in the world, men and women, and in response to the introduction of the DRF policy, women are smart and they decide to stop drinking and driving because they don't want to pay the fines. And men are dumb and they continue to engage in DUIs. And so if we look at the caseload comparison before and after, there'll be both a drop in the level of the caseload after, but then also the share of the caseload that's men will dramatically jump up. And so in terms of thinking about how we could use that to identify causal impacts will be conflated. It'll be biased by the fact that the characteristics are now not balanced between the before and after as we approach the discontinuity.
So for the eventual outcome, you have in mind people who have all committed some offense.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
That defines the analysis sample. So we're looking only at people who have been convicted of DRF-related offenses, right? That's what makes you brings you into the analysis sample.
So one hypothesis is that, like, the policy.
Yeah.
Some people just change their behavior to begin with.
Yeah.
And it's not about reoffense; it's about the first
Yeah,
offense.
exactly.
Be picked up here.
That's exactly right. This is all about first offense, not about kind of how that changes your reoffending behavior going forward. Yeah.
For the deterrent effect to matter, the way you're saying, wouldn't people have to be able to know when they should stop making infractions, given that the conviction date is the relevant date for the cutoff? So.
Well, we can see here that people in Texas really understood that, actually. In Texas, we're going to have to use a donut strategy because there's a huge bunching of the caseload right before the policy becomes effective. Now, keep in mind that there was this 3-month period when they had announced and passed the legislation, yet the policy hadn't gone into effect. So anyone who was charged prior to the implementation date, if they expedited their case processing, then they could avoid the DRF penalty, and that's exactly what we're going to observe. So that's the mechanism more of what I think is influencing the imbalance here, rather than people kind of timing out when they engaged in their driving behavior, because there is this lag between when people are engaging in the DUIs and when they're facing their convictions. Does that make sense? Yeah.
How much control do the defendants have over when they're actually
Yeah, so this is a really important question. So like, let me get through a couple slides and then let's come back to that. There are a lot of ideas that we have about what could be causing this. We don't know, to be honest. One second. So people avoided the DRF in Texas through expedited case processing. So this is now showing the same types of figures. The x-axis is still lining up the caseload according to your conviction date. The y-axis is showing the average amount of time between when your case was charged and when your final disposition was occurred. So what we can observe is that for this big lumpy point right before the policy went into effect for convictions, all of a sudden there was a huge drop in average caseload processing time. So a bunch of people basically figured out a way to get their case resolved or disposed prior to the implementation of this. And so therefore, even though they should have gotten the DRF if it was just treated normally, they managed to get away without paying it. Now, there are a variety of ways that this could happen. It could be because they knew the system, or they negotiated something with the arresting officer to make sure that this was processed more quickly. It could be that maybe prosecutors were more sympathetic and they're like, oh, let's get this guy through because we don't want to give him this fine. We don't really know what led to this, but the empirical fact is that caseload processing times dramatically shrunk. Yeah.
Your earlier remark about the revenue sharing incentives in Texas would suggest it ought to go the other way, that the criminal justice system sort of should tap the brake a little bit so that they move all these people over into the fine regime and collect a whole lot of money.
Well, it could be that, but it could also be that because they had this financial incentive, they were overly aggressive in pursuing these DRF penalties. And so the marginal defendants who are being brought in based off of this incentive actually had the resources to respond and avoid it. And that's actually a great transition because who is it that avoided the Texas DRF penalty? It's not really, although there probably is some degree of avoidance going on for these non-DUI cases with the lower fines. It's really the ones that were facing like $6,000 fines, where you see this massive move from the right to the left-hand side. And who is it that avoided them? Rich white people. You see a very clear shift in the demographic composition in terms of the average prior earnings before the conviction occurred, as well as the proportion that were white. That's consistent with this bunching behavior, that there looks like there was a large set of people who should have been on the right-hand side of the cutoff that shifted to the left, and they were disproportionately white and high income. So this raises a variety of questions about, how is it that these individuals were able to navigate the system, and we just don't have a way of differentiating. It could be better legal representation. It could be discriminatory behavior within Texas, that these individuals were viewed as more sympathetic, or something else. Yeah.
My eyes are terrible. So is that they're earning like $28,000?
Yep.
So it's not like they're like wealthy.
No.
Okay.
Yep.
Just clarifying.
But this is average too, and a lot of these people are going to be young, and so their prior earnings will basically be. Yeah. Jeff, hold on one second. There's a question in the back. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have data about the type of disposition that happened with these cases, because it also occurred to me like the DA could use it as a bargaining chip to get them to plead sooner. Like, hey, if we get you out of here before October, maybe a couple of bucks on the guilty plea, right? So
Yeah.
I wonder if there was any kind of systematic differences, like do they allow a no-low plea versus a guilty plea? So
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I don't think that we've looked at the specific type of conviction that occurred. In CJARs, we do try to differentiate these things. A lot of the data that we get just comes with like a conviction status, and so often it'll be, in terms of our like actual coding, it'll be a conviction of an unknown type rather than a plea deal versus conviction in jury trial or something like that. The vast majority of cases are resolved through a plea in the justice system in general, and likely within this context as well, which then just makes it even easier to manipulate the timing. Yeah, Jesse?
Outside of the donut, it looks like the earnings bars might not line up. I mean, is that
Yeah.
consistent with an impact on first offenses for higher income people? You try and make anything?
Yeah, so we put like a bunch of indices together that I'm going to show you in a second to summarize all the characteristics. We have some slight imbalance in Texas. I think we're like a percentage point off in terms of like the percent white, if I remember correctly. But given that like we're finding null results anyways, I'm not too concerned about that as a source of bias, just because it would be kind of a...
source of bias.
Yeah.
It's sort of like an impact of the policy on behavior that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, in Texas, you see this increasing caseload overall in general. So like, it's just like cases are going up. I don't think this was like an intention of the policy to increase drunk driving. What? Yeah.
If you only focus on the limits right on the left and right side of the donut.
Yeah, I can tell you that this is not a significant difference here, statistically. If that's what your question is.
Yeah, I'm just extrapolating the
Yeah.
left-hand side of the line.
Do you want to test
Yeah.
the difference in the two slopes and not just the difference in the two?
Well, I mean, I don't have a clear reason of why there would be a change in slopes. Environments or these people are being kind of involved in the justice system in different economic environments, and who knows? Yeah.
Is this combining like the DUI and like any kind of offense, like combining
Yeah.
DUI and the
I don't remember, to be honest. I think this is combining everyone, so I think if we just looked at the DUI, it would be even more extreme.
Well, I mean that's what I'm thinking. Like
Yeah.
the income distribution for those two
Yeah.
things is going to be really different. Right?
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah,
the
that's a good
average
point.
is different.
Yeah. Is there another question over here that I missed? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you're tracking
Yeah, that's something that we often don't observe in CJARS data. Unfortunately, we don't often have the type of representation that people have. We get very limited information about the other actors who are involved in a case, like who the judge was, who the prosecutor was, who the defense attorney was, who an arresting officer was. That's usually information that agencies won't share with us.
Is the Patriot paper in Oklahoma limited to people who had public defenders?
Yeah. It would be interesting if we could look at that, but unfortunately that's not what we can do. All right, so there's a clear short run selection issue in Texas. And so the bunching before the cutoff is obviously going to impact the cases before and after, since some people are moving from after to before, and that creates imbalance in the composition. So we're going to exclude convictions within 60 days of the cutoff threshold in Texas specifically. Why don't we observe the same manipulation in Michigan? Well, we don't really know. The fines were higher in Texas, and they had an incentive to actually pursue these because they were getting some of the revenue back. And so maybe there's this issue about going after, going after the caseload more aggressively, and maybe they bit off more than they should have, and as a result, the caseload had more resources to respond and avoid it. Yep.
Mike, did you consider the dry county?
We didn't.
Texas has a bunch of dry counties.
Yeah.
And Mike Conlon and Stacy Dicker-Conlon
Yeah.
wrote a number of papers about that. So if you want to drink, you have to drive through out of these counties quite often.
Yeah, we are definitely missing data from a number of rural counties in Texas just in general, and I've got a feeling that that will overlap with a number of these dry counties. The Texas data
could interact, but I might ask them if I were you.
Yeah, that's a good idea. There could be possible institutional differences by courts, like maybe prosecutors are just more amenable to being nice to white rich people in Texas. I already talked about the revenue in Texas. Sorry, the first point was that maybe because the fines were so much more expensive, maybe defendants really were focused on trying to avoid it. Yeah. All right, so this is trying to look at covariate balance. So we're taking a very large set of covariates and summarizing them into indices. This is your predicted 10-year W-2 earnings in the caseload, and this is showing balance on both Michigan and Texas. You still do see this increase in slope that Jesse was focused on, and then leveling off. I don't really know what the story is with that. It could be, now that I'm thinking about it, it could be an issue of the W-2s only come online in 2005, and so part of that 10-year follow-up. But one thing that's a little weird that's happening is that there's this lag between when you're observed in this caseload and when we can observe your earnings. So the 10-year isn't immediately 10 years following your charge or conviction. It's during this window of 2005 to 2015, which is actually 11 years, which deeply annoys me. But the results were already disclosed, so I don't know. Maybe that's partly part of it. And then this is the predicted recidivism. So the same activity, but this is literally in the 10 years following your conviction, based off of all the covariates that we observe, the likelihood or the total number of charges we expect you to face of any kind. And there are level differences. So in Michigan, we observe significantly more local ordinance violations, and so there are just more charges that people face in Michigan because of data coverage issues. But both of these are statistically balanced. All right. So not to hold back the punch. Can somebody remind me how late we go? 1:30. Okay, great. We're doing great on time. So you guys already know the punchline. This is what we observe in Michigan over a 10-year follow-up period. On the left-hand side is total earnings. On the right-hand side is recidivism. Maybe you see something based off of this line, that there's an increase in earnings, but if you play around with the bandwidth of the window, it's very easy to make that go away. And even if that was an effect, it's a pretty minor effect. We can rule out changes in earnings or recidivism or earnings behavior, I think in excess of 2% or 1% over a 10-year period. There really just isn't, we don't observe clear responsiveness in this population. which we found really surprising. And then we can put up Texas. Basically the same story. Again, like maybe you see like the earnings is very flat. And then maybe you see like a little bit of a jump in recidivism. But again, if you play around with the bandwidth, it's not a very stable result. Yep.
What should your prior have been on earnings impact?
Well, it depends on what literature you come from. If you think about the responsiveness of individuals to like, savings, like getting a cash benefit and their decrease in labor supply, you might think like wouldn't be a very large effect. If you come at it from the literature that's been written about fines and fees, you would think that this would really dramatically lead to a tailspin, and that people wouldn't be able to afford it. They'd get into a cycle of debt. They would, potentially lose their car, their license, and you would expect a really dramatic reduction in employment. So it kind of depends on your perspective that you bring to the study in the first place. But I've definitely presented this to people before, and they're like, yeah, so what? Like it was like a small fine, and over a 10-year period, why should we expect to see any change? Now, to push back again, these are people involved in the justice system. So, even $500 could be a lot of money. There's, really interesting work by Megan Stevenson looking at pretrial detention where, having to pay 10% of a $50 or $500 bail, $50 leads some people to stay in jail for like 30 days because they cannot find $50 to get out of jail. And it's not a trivial share. So, I'm not trying to make light of the numbers. It kind of depends on who you think this is applying to. Yeah.
Again, did you do any kind of separating the different kinds?
Yeah, we've done a lot of that stuff, and I'll show you in a I'll show you in a minute. Yeah.
This is right during the Great Recession.
This is
5, 6, 7, okay.
at the very end. Yeah, I'll show you by time period. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Just clarification, what's in the parentheses for the estimate?
Standard errors, I believe.
Okay, so they're just accidentally negative.
Oh yeah. God. Thank you. Yeah. I'll have to. Yeah, that's our mistake. Thank you. Yeah. I don't know how that got in there.
That's okay for today, but for the conference tomorrow.
I'm not presenting this paper
Yeah,
tomorrow.
but having negative standard errors in front
Yeah.
of administration is probably within there.
Yeah.
Just
We're really pushing the frontiers econometrically to the point where we have negative standard errors. Thank you. Okay, so, obviously this raises the question of like, well, 10 years is a long follow-up period. Maybe this is masking. Because of the variance that emerges over such a long follow-up period, maybe there's something that we're missing. And so here we're looking at the temporal evolution of impacts, and I put Michigan and Texas back together. And in the dark circles are the estimated discontinuities over progressively longer follow-up periods. So the first one is follow-up period of 2005 to 2006. That's the closest that we have to when these events are happening. And by the end, it's our original estimates, 2005 to 2015. And then these gray diamonds that look like they're part of the confidence interval correspond to the mean outcome. So if you want to try to think about the percent effect relative to the evolving mean, basically it doesn't jump out that there's like any response that's happening over time. That it's not like we see this short run impact immediately following when these fines are being due, that then gets masked over time because of the emerging variance of income. It really just seems like a null response. And in some ways that kind of lines up with the public narrative about these policies. A bunch of them got handed out. Some people paid them who probably could afford it and it wasn't a big deal. And then a bunch of people just ignored them, lost their licenses, and then just kept going on with their lives. This is the temporal evolution of cumulative recidivism with the same kind of setup. And again, here it's very stable. We aren't seeing any impacts on future criminal activity. Yep.
Does recidivism, any criminal activity?
This is cumulative, this is total, but we also have the extensive margin and we don't see any impacts there either. Yeah. Yeah, because you might worry, like maybe somebody goes to prison and then that's censoring the number of future criminal activity that they could have, and that's not what's happening. Yep, Jeff.
I think Steve's question, which is this is not just DUI,
No, this is any. Yeah. Sorry, I misinterpreted that. Yeah, this is all. And we do break it out by specific types. And that is a great segue. So I'll bring that up. Thank you. All right, so this is showing a different way to present the results. We've tried to play around with different visualizations. So the light gray, or the lighter pastel versions of the bars, this is the control mean of like what is happening on the left-hand side. And then on top of that, the little dark bar with the standard error, if you squint, is the estimated discontinuity for that outcome. So one thing that we do find is that in Michigan, there is a significant increase in the likelihood, if you were charged with a DRF, of getting charged in the future of driving with a suspended license. So it's exactly that narrative that like you've basically set people up for future failure and getting more fines. Now that increase is like a 2% increase, 2 percentage point increase. So it's modest, minor, I would say. And it's just because a lot of people don't get pulled over. And unless you're getting pulled over for something, you aren't gonna be charged with driving with a suspended license. So you can also look at total felony convictions, drug convictions, property convictions, violent convictions, and they're basically null effects across all of those, as well as on the extensive margin, which is everything but just 0-1 on orange. Yep.
That's an astounding level difference in the fraction of people who are driving without a valid license in the 2 states.
Yeah. I think part of that is because of our coverage of local ordinance offenses in Michigan. Michigan just has a very extensive coverage of these things that are happening at the municipal level. In Texas, that type of offense, a misdemeanor level C, is often handled by justice of the peace. And some of those records are like in paper format. And so it's really hard to measure. So there could be something that because we can't measure is going on. But at least in Michigan, and I think like there's one nice thing about this, like any driving with a suspended license conviction is that like, we don't have the payment information. We don't know what the collection activity was. This is our best indication that this, like we haven't just like made up a policy that didn't exist. Like it does seem like there was an implication of some enforcement for these people. So that's, I guess, reassuring. Because I have time, I'm going to go to other labor market measures just to see what's in here. I'm trying to remember what's in the slides. Okay, so you can also look at the extensive margin, proportion that are filing, have W-2s filed for them. The total number of W-2s, so this is kind of some measure of how many employers they have, although that could be good or bad. Churning through many jobs isn't a good thing, but having more jobs than no jobs is not a bad thing. And then total 1040 reported income, which is going to preview what we're going to see for spouses, because now this is combining everyone in the household together. These are all nulls, and very small relative to the control mean. You might zero in and see something that looks suggestive on any specific graph, but relative to what's just generally going on, these aren't meaningful changes. Okay, so this is showing the heterogeneity analysis. We spent a lot of time thinking about this, and there are additional exercises that aren't in here as well. This is splitting out the caseload because what we were worried about is, well, maybe overall we aren't seeing something in this project because relative to the justice caseload overall, those who have traffic violations, they have cars. And maybe they're richer on average. And so, we're missing that narrative of the poverty trap because we aren't focusing on the relevant subset of the justice caseload that's more like the criminal justice caseload in general. So we can split things out by group. We have occasionally a coefficient that will pop above a significance level, like women in Michigan and above median predicted income. But we can't reject that these are all together, like each pair is not different from each other. These are statistically indistinguishable. And we've even gone further to go through by like decile of predicted income to really maybe look at tails of the income distribution. And we don't see any differences there either. And so that was employment, and then this is recidivism and kind of the same thing. It's a bunch of nulls, which this is a dissatisfying probably talk to give and consume, but it's important, right? Like people are very concerned, and maybe this isn't the best place where we should be investing time and energy as researchers and policymakers in terms of thinking of ways to make the justice system more fair and effective. It doesn't seem like this is actually like one of the things that are creating the outcomes that we're concerned about. So in terms of thinking about spillovers onto romantic partners, justice-involved individuals have weak labor market attachment, as I already described. So maybe it's that the fines are being absorbed by their boyfriends or girlfriends instead. So we're going to link individuals to their romantic partners using this cohabitation and relationship information from the survey and administrative data that we've combined in Finley, Mueller-Smith, and Street 2022. The drawback is that we're only going to be able to identify those who are linked by surveys, taxes, or public benefit participation. And so, if you have a casual boyfriend or girlfriend who is co-residing with you and you never respond to a survey together and never file taxes together and never participate in SNAP together or HUD, then we won't connect you. Or have something else that just locates you together at the same time. Take this with a grain of salt, but I think it does capture a large number. We have balance on the existence of partners across the threshold. So this is, looking at the subset of those who have partners, shouldn't introduce an unexpected source of bias. We're going to look at the same outcomes as before, as well as partnership stability as an outcome itself, because that maybe that's kind of an interesting thing. Like, does the creation of this significant penalty all of a sudden lead to disruptions in the relationship? Don't get your hopes up. We don't find anything there. So these are the outcomes for the partners. Again, just to vary up the visualization, we have the plots in the paper too, but this is, again, showing these stacked bar charts where it's the mean and then the treatment effect on top of it. In some cases, it goes into the mean when it's negative. And here, it's really, some of the standard errors are a bit larger because it's a smaller population. So naturally, just like the variance is going to be higher, but we aren't really seeing any meaningful impacts here. Yeah.
Who paid and who didn't pay?
We don't have any information on payment, unfortunately. That was handled.
You said you knew that about 50%.
We know that from aggregate caseload reports from the state itself. They had a lot of public discourse when they were considering discontinuing the policy. So we can rely on state-like reports about it, but because that was handled by the Secretary of State and they were unwilling to share data with us, we don't have any payment information. Yeah. But sorry, I cut you off. I want to hear.
I was just going to say, I was just curious if there was differences of who was paying.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that would be really interesting. And then since we have time and we can do it, you can also see that there's no impact on whether or not you're still in the partnership by the end of the time period and the number of years that we observe people linked together during the follow period. I don't know, I kind of find this kind of surprising. Like a $6,000 fine and for a DUI kind of feels like something that would be a wake-up call for someone. I don't know. I mean, I could see that creating phrased differently, I wouldn't be surprised if there were significant effects. I wouldn't be like, oh, that's ludicrous. So I don't know. I find the fact that these are all nulls is kind of interesting.
I just have thoughts for DUI. So what fraction are DUIs, and then did you show us by triggering event whether it was the DUI or one of the others?
Yeah. So I think about something like 40% of the cases are DUIs. It's a good portion. So at least I know in Michigan, the level 1, level 2, and level 3, there are a bunch that are level 1 that are really low, not that many that are level 2, and then a bunch that are level 3, which are the DUIs. And we've done the results separately by those levels, and we don't really find strong differences either. Because there's another really interesting hypothesis there about the fine levels, right? Because these are really different fines, and so maybe there's a dosage thing going on. And then we went down the path of, well, if you intersect affordability based off of their prior income and dosage, and then you have this matrix of 10 different treatment effects that you've estimated, maybe one of them is significant at the 10% level, and then we have 5 referees from the JP saying that we're overinterpreting the data, which on reflection, I agree with. So, yeah.
Did you look at whether there was any impact on the non-financial sanctions, so reduction in the length of time, jail sentences, or?
Yeah, that's really important for the exclusion restriction. We don't find any changes on other sentencing outcomes. Yeah, that's really important.
Do you have a I mean, I think maybe the answer is no, what I'm asking, but it's like, how big is $6,000 if you add up all of the costs of an arrest, right? The missing time and arranging other transportation and other fines and representation. Like, is $6,000 a big number relative to that, or is
I think so.
number relative to
Yeah, I think so. So I don't know about the like kind of time. So like, it's hard to know how to quantify that. So if you spend 24 hours in jail and lose your job, that's a really significant cost. But I'm not going to consider that. If you consider it relative to the other kind of fines and fees that people face, it's a really significant increase. I think that people don't talk about these in the thousands of dollars. It's usually like in the hundreds of dollars, because you have a bunch of like $20, $30, $40 things that you kind of have to file a bunch of times, and that adds up, but not anywhere on the magnitude that we're talking about in this.
I mean, if you lose your license, you have to come up with other forms of transportation.
No, I think people just drove with the suspended license. I mean, if you have to get to your job, you just go, and you drive carefully, and you don't get pulled over, and then there's no consequence, right? There's no system that's like pointing out people. This person doesn't have a license, right? Like, it's just you're driving unless you get pulled over for something else, and they check. You aren't gonna get it. Yeah.
I have a question related to that. So the way you've been sort of telling the story is that you don't pay the fine, and then your license gets suspended.
Yep.
Isn't your license already suspended for getting a DUI?
No, not in this case. It can be.
Not in any of these cases?
It can. Your license can be suspended as a result of your conviction. That could be, you could have a suspension, especially for repeat DUIs. That often happens, but it's not automatically suspended if you get a DUI conviction.
But it could be.
It could
for
be.
a
Yeah.
lot of these people, right?
Yeah.
In which case, like, you already don't have your license. You're not paying your fine, so then your employment maybe doesn't change, or your earnings don't change
Yeah.
as a result of that. Like, the shock isn't the same.
Yeah, I mean, given the way these policies, so I don't know the share of DUI convictions that result in a license suspension. Given the way the policy was designed, I expect that it's low, because that was the only enforcement mechanism they had in place. Like, if they were targeting reducing DUIs and everyone was already getting their license suspended, then they've kind of really hamstring their policy by using an enforcement tool that doesn't have any bite. So I have to assume that but as I said, policymakers make weird decisions sometimes, and so who knows? But that could also be part of it. But it's like, if you look at the levels, the earnings amounts aren't unreasonable. They're doing quite well relative to the justice caseload in general, which just reflects the fact that, as I said, they have cars, they're consuming alcohol. That's also a potential sign of financial stability, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
To follow up on Christine's comment, have you tried separating it out by prior DUI offenses?
We've done it by, I'm going to go back for a second. We went down this long rabbit hole of, so part of the challenge in interpreting these results, and I want to call your attention to these last 2 rows, predicted high risk of DRF recidivism and low predicted risk of DRF recidivism. We were really interested in the idea that of what the impact of these driver's license suspensions would be. And part of the challenge in interpreting this is that everyone's being followed up. The outcome period is while DRFs are in effect for everyone. So now if you're on the control group side and you have committed a DUI in the future, and then you get a DRF and you get your license suspended, you're just like the treatment group. And perhaps that's part of the reason why we find null results. And so in that setting, we use your prior criminal history as well as a variety of other things to try to predict the likelihood that you will go on to get a DRF in the follow-up period, and then split the analysis sample out between those who have a high likelihood. Like, I think it was in the exercise, it was something like 75 or 50% of them get DRFs within 5 years. And then the other group, it's like very low through the entire follow-up period. These are like the one-offs to try to disentangle the impact of the fine versus losing your license. And we don't find any differences in impacts for those two groups. So that was like months of work that now is 2 data points and an appendix. But I mean, these questions are really important, right? Because like, you don't want to go around and say there's no impact of a policy when it's just because we were too dumb to think about like the way that our research design wasn't sophisticated enough to capture the dynamics that are playing out. Like that's irresponsible research, and that's not what we're trying to do here. Okay, let me go back. All right, I think I'm going to end early, which is fine. So what is the point of this paper? We're finding, we come up with findings that provide consistent evidence of precise null impacts of the DRF programs. The results across the 2 natural experiments strengthen both internal and external validity. The degree of similarity is potentially surprising. Even though they're the same programs, there are some clear differences between Michigan and Texas. Like the average DRF amount in Michigan was about $1,400 versus $2,500 in Texas. If you think that there's a dosage response, we don't find evidence consistent with that. There is revenue sharing in Texas and not Michigan. There are differences in the payment plans that Michigan set up versus the incentive program that was adopted in Texas. And there's different demographic groups and economic conditions in these 2 places. You know, like just something simple like the amount of driving that happens in Texas is substantially larger than in Michigan. So it's in some ways it's kind of surprising that at least they're like consistent with each other. So was the DRF good public policy? Well, let's just recap. The point The point of the program was to discourage unsafe driving and reduce highway fatalities and raise public revenue. There is no evidence that these goals were met. So we find no general deterrence response. The fee collection rates were around 50% based off of public reports from the latter half after all of these additional support programs were put in place. The programs were discontinued. Like they already knew that it wasn't popular and functional. They stopped them in 2018 and 2019. But at the same time, there's no evidence that these generated the poverty traps that critics allege. No decline in employment or earnings on average or within subgroups. No increase in future criminal activity on average and within subgroups. So, it's kind of like it didn't achieve its goals. It wasn't so horrible, but like, why do this? Why basically try to raise revenue from a share of the population that's disproportionately low income? Just doesn't seem like a sensible policy to me. Obviously, this isn't a formal social welfare analysis. I know that can be a triggering word for people, but to me, this just doesn't seem to make sense. So in conclusion, despite growing popular concern about fines and fees, limited causal evidence exists. So we're confirming and extending the recent RCT findings that showed that there was no impact on recidivism over a 1-year horizon in Oklahoma County using RD natural experiments that replicate the null recidivism findings from Oklahoma in 2 statewide populations, provide new evaluation of employment and earnings outcomes, have the first inclusion of relationship and household spillover outcomes, and expand this outcome window from 1 to 10 years. So I think like this is between the RCT and this, I think we're really kind of pushing our knowledge about what these fines and fees potentially are doing in the population forward quite substantially. But future work should continue to explore other types of fines and fees. And my co-author, Elizabeth Liu, is going on the job market this year, and we have another paper that's looking at discontinuities in misdemeanor fees and fines more generally in 5 different states. Those results haven't been disclosed yet. So I'm not going to say anything, and I'm going to stop before I violate any rules. I know this is being recorded. So, we should be looking at other contexts. That's important. And, there should be some way that this is affecting individual outcomes. And so one of the thoughts that we have in this new project is to try to look at changes in consumption patterns and linking into like the ACS looking at how much people are spending on housing and in gas and all this other type of stuff, because, maybe it's not showing up in terms of formal employment, but maybe, there is a welfare impact on people and that consumption is contracting, right? That would be problematic.
Even home ownership, just home ownership.
Yep, or home ownership. Yep, exactly. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to share this research with you. And just to fit one last evangelizing statement in, please consider using CJARs. We put a lot of work into creating it, and it only kind of makes sense if other people are using it too. It's been a big fixed cost, and we want to amortize that over many, many research projects. So reach out if you want to use our data. Thank you.